Every night, a red point of light rises in the east, bright enough to see without a telescope, moving against a background of stars that don't share its color. Every culture that has ever watched the sky has named it. For most of human history, no one could explain why it glowed red, while nothing else up there did. Today the answer is simple: iron oxide, rust. Mars is red because its surface is covered in oxidized iron dust, the same chemistry that turns an old nail orange. That's the finding of more than half a century of spacecraft data, and it isn't in dispute. What this video is about is a different claim, one that circulates widely online, attached to the Book of Enoch, a text genuinely excluded from the Western Bible in 364 CE and genuinely preserved for centuries in Ethiopia. The claim is that Enoch contains a passage describing Mars directly, calling it the world that was judged, and describing beings who lived there before fleeing to Earth. We're going to walk through that claim carefully: what's real about the manuscript tradition, what's real about Mars, and what happens when you actually try to locate this specific passage in the text. This is worth doing carefully rather than quickly, because the claim is built cleverly. It doesn't invent a text from nothing. It borrows a real, genuinely obscure ancient document, attaches it to real, well-documented modern space science, and fills the gap between them with details specific enough to sound checkable. That combination is exactly what makes this kind of claim spread, and exactly why it's worth slowing down and checking each piece separately instead of taking the whole package on faith. Before we go further, subscribe now if this kind of textual and historical exploration is what you are here for. Every week this channel examines ancient texts, scholarly debates, and the interpretive questions that mainstream discourse sometimes leaves at the edge. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. What's real about the Enoch manuscript tradition? The Book of Enoch, properly First Enoch, to distinguish it from later Slavonic and Hebrew works that also carry Enoch's name, is a real composite text, assembled from several originally separate works, including the Book of the Watchers, the Astronomical Book, and the Epistle of Enoch. It was excluded from the canon that became the Western Bible, most concretely at the Regional Council of Laodicea in 364 CE, though the broader process of canon formation was gradual and involved many councils and church figures over centuries. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is the one Christian tradition that kept it in Scripture, preserving it in Ge'ez, and the earliest known fragments, in Aramaic, were recovered from Qumran Cave 4 after 1947, catalogued in the range 4Q201 through 4Q212. Joseph Milik really did spend decades cataloging this material for the École Biblique in Jerusalem, and published the foundational critical edition of the Aramaic fragments in 1976. Florentino Garcia Martinez, James Vanderkam, George Nickelsburg, and Lauren Stuckenbrook are all real, major scholars of this material, and their general scholarly positions, that parts of the Enoch tradition are genuinely difficult to interpret, that its cosmological sections have drawn less sustained study than the Watcher's narrative, are fair characterizations of how cautiously academic Enoch scholarship tends to write. None of that, however, is the same as confirming that a specific red world passage exists. That's the claim that needs to be checked directly, rather than assumed because the surrounding scholarly names are real. It's also worth being specific about how First Enoch is actually structured, because that structure is what makes the red world claim checkable in the first place. The text as it survives divides into 5 recognized major sections: the Book of the Watchers, 1 through 36, the Book of Parables, 37 to 71, the Astronomical Book, 72 to 82, the Book of Dream Visions, 83 to 90, and the Epistle of Enoch, 91. Every one of these sections has been translated, published, and cross-checked against the Aramaic Qumran fragments where they survive. There is no 6th section, no hidden chapter range, and no scholarly consensus pointing to missing material specifically describing another inhabited world. If a passage like the one described in this claim existed anywhere in the manuscript tradition, it would sit inside one of these 5 sections, and none of them contain it. Does the red world passage actually exist? This is the most important thing to say plainly in this video. No section of First Enoch, in any published critical edition, Ethiopic, Aramaic, or Greek, contains a passage describing a red world, a first Earth, distinct from our own, or beings who fled a planetary judgment before the biblical flood. The astronomical book, chapters 72 to 82, discusses the sun, moon, winds, and stars in detail. The Book of the Watchers discusses the fallen angels and their punishment. Neither section, nor any other part of the text as it survives, in Nickelsburg's, Knibb's, or Isaac's editions, contains material matching this description. The framing used in some retellings, a passage preserved only in a restricted Axum archive, referenced only in a scholar's unpublished private correspondence, attributed to a Qumran subseries with no public catalog entry, is structured so that it cannot be checked against any published source. That structure is itself a signal worth naming. A real citation points you toward a document you can go find. A citation to material that is, by the claim's own description, unavailable to check functions differently. It borrows the credibility of real scholars and real manuscripts while placing the actual evidence permanently out of reach. That doesn't prove bad faith on anyone's part, but it does mean this specific Red World passage cannot be treated as an established part of the Enoch textual tradition. As far as the published, checkable record goes, it does not exist. There's a second tell worth pointing out, separate from the missing citation trail. The passage's content leans heavily on details Mars science only established in the 20th century. Phobos's fast orbit, magnetospheric collapse, subsurface polar water, while presenting them as things a 3rd century BCE author observed directly. A genuinely ancient cosmological text, even a strange and speculative one, reflects the cosmology available to its actual era. Fixed stars, spheres, a geocentric sky. It doesn't anticipate spacecraft-era planetary geology in specific, itemized detail. That mismatch between the claimed date of composition and the specificity of the content is, on its own, a reason for real skepticism, independent of the citation problem. The actual astronomical book, the real chapters 72 through 82 that do survive and are extensively studied, is a useful comparison here. It describes the movements of the sun and moon through 12 gates, a system of calendrical reckoning tied to a 364-day solar year, genuinely unusual and genuinely debated among scholars for what it suggests about the community that composed it. But it describes these things in the vocabulary and cosmology of its own era: gates, luminaries, angels assigned to seasons. It does not describe orbital mechanics, magnetic fields, or a second planet. The real text is strange in ways appropriate to a 3rd century BCE document. The Red World passage is strange in ways appropriate to a script written after 2018 spacecraft data was already public, which is, itself, a clue about which one is genuinely ancient. What's real about Mars? Separate from the manuscript question, the astronomy in this story is largely accurate and worth explaining on its own terms. Mars's atmosphere is indeed thin, less than 1% the surface pressure of Earth's. Its surface is genuinely dry, oxidized, and colored by iron minerals. In 2018, the European Space Agency's Mars Express radar did report evidence consistent with a body of liquid water beneath the southern polar ice cap, a finding that generated real scientific debate about its interpretation and confirmation. Some researchers have since questioned whether the radar signature reflects liquid water at all, versus other explanations like clay-rich or frozen sediment layers, and the question remains genuinely open in the planetary science literature, rather than settled in either direction. Phobos and Deimos, Mars's 2 small moons, are also real, and Phobos really does complete an orbit in under 8 hours, fast enough that it rises in the west and sets in the east within a single Martian night, a genuinely unusual behavior among moons in the solar system. Vias Marineris, the canyon system stretching roughly 4,000 kilometers along the Martian equator, is real and is understood by planetary geologists to have formed through tectonic rifting rather than water erosion. And Mars's global magnetic field really did collapse roughly 4 billion years ago. NASA's MAVEN mission, active since 2014 under principal investigator Bruce Jakosky, has published peer-reviewed findings in Science documenting ongoing atmospheric loss to solar wind in the absence of that protective field. All of that is genuine, well-established planetary science. Mars is a real, dramatic story of atmospheric loss entirely on its own, without needing an ancient text to make it interesting. None of these facts, individually or together, requires an ancient source to have predicted them. Modern planetary science reached each of these conclusions through direct observation. Orbiters, landers, radar, spectrometers, decades of accumulated data, not through decoding old manuscripts. When a claim lines up a list of genuine modern findings next to a genuinely ancient text and calls the alignment a match, it's worth asking what the match actually consists of. Usually, a modern description of Mars gets paired with a vague or reworded phrase attributed to the ancient text, rather than the ancient text's actual, checkable wording. The Mars science in this story doesn't need Enoch to be true. It's already established on its own evidentiary basis. Cydonia and the face on Mars, what the later images actually showed. The Cydonia region and its face formation are real too. But the story is more resolved than this kind of retelling usually lets on. NASA's Viking 1 orbiter did photograph a mesa in Sidonia in 1976 that, at that resolution and lighting angle, resembled a face. Richard Hoagland did promote the idea that Sidonia contained deliberately constructed geometric structures through the 1980s and 90s. What typically gets left out is what happened next, when the Mars Global Surveyor returned much higher resolution images of the same region starting in 1998, and later missions imaged it again under different lighting. The face resolved into an ordinary eroded mesa, geologically unremarkable and consistent with wind and impact erosion seen throughout the region. NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory published these follow-up images specifically to address the earlier speculation. The scientific consensus on Sidonia isn't an unexamined dismissal. It's a claim that was tested against better data and didn't hold up. This pattern, a low-resolution image generating a striking impression, followed by higher-resolution data that resolves the ambiguity in an ordinary direction, is common in planetary imaging generally, not unique to Sidonia. Pareidolia, the tendency of the human visual system to find faces and deliberate patterns in random or partially obscured shapes, is well documented in psychology and shows up reliably whenever low-resolution, harshly lit imagery leaves room for interpretation. That's not a dismissal of the people who found the original 1976 image compelling. At that resolution, the resemblance really was striking. It's an explanation for why the compelling first impression and the better-informed later conclusion can both be genuine reactions to real data, taken at different points in the imaging timeline. What is established and what remains unverified? What can be independently verified? First Enoch is a real, ancient composite text with a genuine, well-documented exclusion and preservation history. Its Qumran fragments, an Ethiopic manuscript tradition, are real. Mars's thin atmosphere, iron oxide surface, two small fast-orbiting moons, Valles Marineris, its ancient magnetic field collapse, and its ongoing atmospheric stripping by solar wind are all real, peer-reviewed planetary science. The original Cydonia face image and the later high-resolution imaging that resolved it as a natural mesa are both real and publicly available from NASA. What is not established, no published critical edition of First Enoch contains a red world passage describing Mars, a first Earth, or beings who fled a planetary judgment. The specific citations built around this claim: Milik's unpublished correspondence, a 1998 Garcia Martinez paper describing the passage, a declined 2019 Hebrew University grant application, an evasive 2022 follow-up interview, could not be located in any real publication or record, and do not check out. The idea that Sidonia's formations are artificial has been directly tested against higher resolution data and did not hold up, which makes it a resolved question rather than an open one. What is worth holding on to? None of this makes Mars less remarkable. A planet that lost its magnetic shield, its atmosphere, and its liquid water over billions of years, and that still shows two small moons doing something no other moon in the solar system does, is a genuinely strange place. Strange enough that it doesn't need an invented ancient text to make the case. And none of it makes First Enoch less worth studying either. It's a real, difficult, genuinely old document that says a great deal about angels, judgment, and the structure of the heavens as its authors understood them. Just not on the evidence that actually exists about the fourth planet from the sun. The honest version of this story is two real, separate, fascinating subjects: an ancient apocryphal text and a rusted, wind-stripped world, that this particular retelling wired together with a passage that isn't there. There's a broader habit worth naming here, because it's not unique to this one video, and it's worth being able to spot on your own. Take a genuinely obscure, genuinely under-translated ancient text, something most viewers have never read a full translation of, and have no easy way to check firsthand, and pair it with a genuinely dramatic modern scientific finding that most viewers also haven't verified themselves. Bridge the two with specific-sounding but uncheckable details: a scholar's private notes, a declined grant application, an interview that ends abruptly. Each piece alone might pass a quick glance. What breaks the story apart is going to the primary sources directly, reading Nickelsburg's actual commentary, checking whether a cited paper exists, looking at the Mars Global Surveyor images for yourself, rather than trusting that the citation trail has already been checked by whoever assembled it. That habit of checking is really the only defense against this genre of content, and it's available to anyone. The Ge'ez and Aramaic texts of Enoch have been translated and published for over a century, in editions any library or university database can provide. NASA and ESA publish their raw mission data publicly, down to the individual instrument readings. None of the primary sources in this story are hidden, which is itself informative, since the claim's own internal logic depends specifically on the one piece of supposed evidence, the Red World passage itself, being permanently unavailable to check.